Okay, all right. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see everybody online. All right, so good evening, everybody. My name is Harriet Davies-Mostert, and I'm privileged to be the head of conservation at the Endangered Wildlife Trust. Tonight's panel discussion is going to, Wild Chat is going to be a panel discussion interspersed with some questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A function to pose your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. We might not be able to answer all of them though, so we'll be able to follow up with you afterwards. I'm really delighted to be facilitating tonight's Wild Chat, as although my current portfolio covers the entire suite of EWT programs, I started off my career as a carnivore conservation biologist, studying African wild dogs in Mbizah National Park in Zimbabwe. And I spent the next 12 years working on this amazing species. So carnivores are very close to my heart. Carnivores, by their very definition, are animals that mostly eat other animals. And most, but not all of them, belong to the order Carnivore. And they come in all shapes and sizes, from the very small dwarf mongoose to the enormous southern elephant seal. And South Africa is home to 39 different species of carnivores, including both the terrestrial ones and also the marine living ones. And carnivores are really important for functional and healthy landscapes because they do a number of things. They keep ecosystems in balance by keeping prey populations in check. They're really key umbrella species because often by conserving areas that are suitable for carnivores, you're also able to conserve many other species at the same time. They're a really important tourism draw card, and this is especially true for large carnivores like lions and leopards, both of which are part of tourism's Big Five. And carnivores are also cultural icons. Human history across the globe is interlaced with tales of our relationships with carnivores, from wolves and bears to tigers and lions. And all of them have enriched the tapestry of our human existence in some shape or form. However, carnivores, and especially large ones, are under grave threat. They often require large ranges, they need functioning systems with populations of their prey, and they very often come into conflict with people over livestock. And indeed, for some large carnivores, protected areas really hold the only hope for their future. Many of you who are familiar with the EWT will know that the organization was founded in 1973, in part because the founder, Clive Walker, was moved to sell one of his paintings to raise money for cheetah conservation after seeing a cheetah skin hanging for sale in a market. Our logo is the stylized cheetah spoor, so we identify very strongly with carnivores. Our carnivore conservation program was established in the late 1980s, headed up by the world-renowned Dr. Gus Mills, who really needs no introduction in conservation circles. This evening, I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists to you. We've specifically chosen these panelists because in 4 days' time, South Africa will be celebrating National Women's Day. Since 1995, this day has been celebrated each year on the 9th of August to commemorate the 1956 march of approximately 20,000 women to the Union buildings in Pretoria to petition against the country's past laws. In fact, in South Africa, the whole month of August is dedicated to acknowledging and celebrating women. Today, we celebrate three women panelists who are going to talk to us about why carnivore conservation is so important and share some of their own experiences as women in conservation. To start off, let me introduce Dr. Amy Dickman, who's a senior research fellow in felid conservation at the University of Oxford's Wildlife Conservation Research Unit, otherwise known as Wild Crew. And she's also director of Oxford's Ruaha Carnivore Project. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful. She's written more than 50 articles and book chapters on large carnivore conservation and has been instrumental in designing several strategies for carnivores across Africa. I'm going to let Amy tell you more about what she actually does, but I'm sure when she's doing it, she won't mention that she's the recipient of the 2011 Rabinowitz Kaplan Award for the next generation in cat wildcat conservation. And she's also been a finalist for the 2014 Tusk Conservation Awards. So Amy, maybe you can kick things off tonight by just letting us know a little bit about your work with carnivores.
Thanks so much, Harriet, and thank you everyone for attending. It's really lovely to be here. We're in this strange post-COVID world, or in the middle of COVID world, unfortunately. But really fantastic to be here. And at the moment, unfortunately, the field seems a long way away. I'm stuck in the UK under my daughter's bunk bed. So these are definitely different times. But I run a project, as Harriet said, called the Ruaha Carnivore Project, and that's in southern Tanzania. And I've been involved in conservation for a long time, but when I did my PhD, I was working down in this landscape in southern Tanzania because I'd always had this fascination of going to the Serengeti. You know, I'd grown up with all these amazing images and stories about, you know, lions and other animals in the Serengeti. So I was really fortunate to connect with Sarah Durant, who runs the Serengeti Cheetah Project. And she promptly, after I'd really fallen in love with the Serengeti in reality, sent me down to Ruaha because she said, you know, everyone works in Serengeti, no one knows what's happening in Ruaha. And I'd never heard of it. And surely enough, I went down there and it was just a spectacular landscape, amazing for wild dogs, cheetahs, lions, one of the most significant lion populations left in the world, but really understudied. And my PhD and master's really showed that people hated carnivores there, but they all said they didn't kill them, which seemed unlikely. So I spent the time after my PhD, I got a fellowship through Oxford to start the Carnivore Project and actually look at whether that conflict was translating into real killing, and it was translating into huge killing. In fact, the amount of killing we found on village land was the highest documented rate of lion mortality anywhere in East Africa. And so for the past decade now, we've been working with local communities on the edge of this spectacular park, trying to reduce the costs of carnivore presence to them by protecting livestock, protecting people, and giving them tangible benefits from the presence of carnivores, things like performance payments, working with the warriors, working critically with women and children to ensure that all aspects of the society feel that wildlife, including carnivores, is a benefit to them. And we've seen that killing come down by over 80%. We've really seen communities becoming empowered through conservation. So yeah, it's exciting, and a fantastic team on the field still today doing it. So that's really great. You're muted, Harriet.
Thank you. Must seem quite surreal sitting under your daughter's bunk bed while you talk about these landscapes. So welcome, and I'm very pleased to have you on the panel tonight, Amy. It's really great. For those of you, I mean, most people don't know, I mean, I met you about 20 years ago, I remember. Gosh, time has flown, but lovely to have you on tonight's Wild Chat. So to introduce the second panelist, Dr. Morangels Mbizah. She's also an alumni of Wild Crew, and she's a conservation biologist and the founder and executive director of Wildlife Conservation Action, an organization dedicated to conserving biodiversity, promoting human-wildlife coexistence, and empowering local communities. Welcome, Morangels. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Thank you, Harriet, and good evening, everyone. I'm mainly focusing on the intersection of conservation and community development. I founded my organization a few years ago, and it was mostly born out of my passion for communities that live along wildlife, and the need to involve these communities more in wildlife conservation and to really have them at the center of conservation. So I'm currently working around Matsadona, where you worked, Harriet, and around that region in Sebungwe and across the Zambezi Valley. And we are working with local communities, and we are trying to empower these communities so that they can be able to coexist with wildlife and also get direct or indirect benefits from living with wildlife. I think we have realized that although people are at the center of the problems and the threats that wildlife is facing at the moment, they are also at the center of the solutions. So we really need to engage with these local communities to deal with these problems and these threats, especially the threats of habitat fragmentation and habitat loss, poaching. We also have retaliatory killing from human-wildlife conflict. So we need to work with these communities to address all these problems. So that's what we are currently doing at the moment. And also in this landscape, over the past few years, there has been a depletion in wildlife. The habitat also has been degraded over the past few years, and there's been very little interest in conservation, and very little funding has been put into that landscape. So things are starting to move at the moment, and I'm working as the focal area working group leader in the Carnivore Conservation Coalition. So my role is trying to coordinate the activities of the stakeholders working in this landscape, so that we can collaboratively work together and help restore this landscape, and also help to restore the population of wildlife so that it can be viable again.
Thanks, More Angels. I think that you've sort of underscored the importance of these transboundary collaborations, so critical. And I think in a place, certainly in the places like the places you work, there's a very limited amount of resources that go into conservation. There's so many other issues that people are having to deal with. And so, I mean, I think it would be wonderful when we can unlock some, transboundary resources through these larger projects. So fantastic to hear what you're doing. All right, so moving on to the third panelist. So Samantha Nicholson is the African Lion Database Coordinator at the EWT. And Sam had a very successful start to her conservation career, having received a distinction for her Masters on African Wild Dogs at Rhodes University. Sam has, well, some would say she's a turncoat, but she's shifted her focus to lions and is now an active member of the IUCN Cat Specialist Group and the Lion Management Forum in South Africa. Sam, would you like to let everybody know a little bit about what you're up to?
Yes, thanks, Harriet. So hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining tonight. It's great to spend this evening with everyone. So as Harriet mentioned, I'm the coordinator of the African Lion Database. So basically my project aims to consolidate lion population and distribution data from across Africa. So generally the data that currently exists tends to be siloed in different institutions, different researchers' laptops, and different governments. So the role of that project is actually to get all that data in one kind of data repository so that it can be used effectively to guide conservation action and make effective decision making. So earlier this year, we actually expanded the African Lion Database to incorporate anthropogenic mortality. So that's specifically where lions have been killed by people, either through conflict situations or where lions have been accidentally caught in snares or where they have been purposefully poached for parts. So my career at the EWT is in its 6th year. Yeah, this month. So I actually started as an intern working in the conservation science unit. I then did a little stint in the wildlife and energy program, and I'm back full-time with the conservation science unit where my sole focus is the ALD. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I keep forgetting to turn, after all these months, you would think someone would know how to turn off the mute button, but all right, thank you so much, Sam. So we've got you're doing quite a different sort of portfolio of work from Amy and More Angels, who seem to be, you're more sort of field-based, whereas Sam, you're doing more sort of behind-the-scenes data management. So I'm going to start with you by asking, in this current COVID situation that we find ourselves in, how has that changed the way that you work, Sam, and and how?
So it hasn't really changed the way that I work. I mean, all that's really changed is my laptop has gone from the office to home, and I now have, instead of my colleagues, I've got dogs that keep me company all day, which is great. But initially at the beginning of lockdown, it really kind of benefited me because I found that, researchers who are in the field all the time and doing the work on the ground were now actually stuck in their offices in lockdown in their respective countries and in front of their computers. So initially I found that there was this flurry of data and people were a lot more responsive on emails. But I found that as the months go by, slowly kind of shifting back where people are now either getting back into the field or their energy is focused on more pressing issues, like either working with communities and spreading more awareness on COVID and, or actually guiding their efforts towards looking for further funding, because, as we know, protected areas aren't receiving as much money at the moment because of a lack of tourism. So kind of shifted towards looking for other funding opportunities. So I'm now on that other end where data is not quite coming in as quickly, but it's allowing me to do the more nitty-gritty side of the ALD, where we are like writing up our kind of formal processes and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think, you know, when all of this started and we found ourselves not having to travel to the office, we all were under some misconception that we were going to have more time on our hands for things. And that's probably why you did get some of this initial flurry of responses. But I think life quickly caught up with everyone, and now we're all just as busy or even busier than we ever were. You touched on a point there, Sam, about communities. And I think that's for you, well, for both you, Marangels and Amy, but I'm going to ask Marangels first. You know, you mentioned about, you know, empowering communities and working with communities. What has this COVID, you know, the restrictions around COVID meant for your ability to get that kind of work done?
Yeah, so we haven't been able to do much field work since the pandemic started, but I think it gave us a great opportunity to sit down and start to reflect on what we can do differently, because I think we are all not prepared for this. Like, no one saw it coming, and there were no mechanisms to cushion the communities against this. So I think it gave us a time to reflect on how we can look for alternatives for these communities, because most of them depend on tourism for their livelihoods, for their income. So without tourism, now they are in a situation where they can't afford to look after their families. And so we need to think about ways that we are sustainable, that can withstand such pandemics or any unforeseen circumstances. So we really need to start thinking about those solutions and start to plan towards that. I think, on the other hand, it was also an opportunity for people like me who work in the field to spend some time with family, with friends, away from the field. Yeah, and also catch up on grant writing, applying for funding. And I think it's so difficult now because there is very little funding out there, and everyone is in need of the funding because of the COVID and the complications that came with it. So it's really a time where we are trying to get the funding. We are trying to write reports, doing the data analysis, and catching up on all the other work that we can do in the field.
Yeah, I think that people tend to have a sort of glorified idea of what fieldwork is, and actually, as you say, being able to just get some crunch time in and actually get through some of the admin is probably really valuable to you. So thanks for that. I mean, on just talking about the impact of COVID on tourism and what that means for conservation, Amy, you are a co-author on a paper that just came out this last week about specifically these issues in this region. Would you like to tell us all a little bit more about that?
Yes, it is something we were looking at. So obviously, this is such a critical issue for conservation. Conservation, even before COVID, in our existing model, doesn't cover the costs needed for effectively protecting even the protected areas, let alone looking at the range of these wildlife beyond protected areas. So unfortunately, the COVID pandemic, when it struck, has really amplified the threats to conservation. It's reduced the funding available that comes from user funding. So things like tourism, trophy hunting, whatever, that user-based income that comes in is obviously almost completely dried up because of international travel restrictions. Simultaneously, as Marangels was mentioning there, the wider funding, the philanthropy, the state funding has all tended to have to be, you know, reallocated to other places because this has been an unprecedented economic shock globally and people's priorities are changing. So we've seen massively reduced funding for conservation in our traditional models. And also then you're likely, as this drags on, to see increased threats to those places because people tend to retreat, particularly in rural areas, towards needing more resource extraction from natural places. They tend to rely more on whether it's charcoal or bushmeat or forest clearance. All these things are likely to amplify those threats. So we've got kind of a perfect storm of reduced funding, increased threats, and just a diverted global attention from these issues. But it's really vital when we're thinking about how to move forward we need to safeguard nature, because that will really help reduce future pandemic risks as well. Investing in nature, investing in these economies, making sure, as Angel said, that we build a more resilient future for wildlife and for people. And this is something that we explore in the paper about how do we change this very singular model of sort of either donor or user-based funding towards maybe global biodiversity credits, looking at the global north paying more for people bearing the brunt of conservation, often in the global south. So all of these issues, just talking about it and thinking about, we must be able to build a better future for people and for wildlife.
Yeah, I think it's a really almost intractable issue, and because it is competing with so many other needs at the moment. I mean, as a slight aside, I mean, we at the EWT, we're engaging a lot with the government at the moment to talk about ways to make sure that sources of funding for conservation in the environment don't get completely diverted. And part of the argument there is about saying that the environment is not different from human health. It's not different from education or early childhood development or anything. It's actually the bedrock on which all of those things need to happen. And so we need to really push to get people to sort of do a bit of a mind shift about thinking of environment as an add-on rather than the essential sort of base layer for everything. Obviously, carnivores are different from things like ecosystem services in many ways. It's easy to make the case for water and sanitation to be linked to good catchment management, and less so for things like lions that come out of protected areas and cause lots of hassle for people. But, so I'm going to just take a question from the Q&A. Sam, for you, there was a question here about, does your database, is from Penny Abbott, does your database enable a picture of the effect of captive lion breeding?
So in short, no. The database only includes lions from wild systems. So yeah, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but no captive lions are included in the ALD. So unfortunately, it won't help with that answer.
But we were talking earlier today about some of the impacts of, we know that wildlife trade is strongly linked to this latest global shock that we've just experienced. How are you capturing issues of wildlife trade, particularly we know lion trade is picking up, for example, in the work that you do, Sam?
Yeah, so that actually is incorporated in our anthropogenic mortality data collection. So a strong component of that is looking at where lions are killed and if body parts have been removed, and if they have, what body parts are removed. So we can kind of identify a kind of continental picture to see where threats for trade are either emerging or are increasing. So yeah.
So you talk about it like everybody knows what you're talking about, but when you say body removal, I mean body parts being removed, I mean, what does that tell you, and what does that mean?
So we are seeing instances where body parts like skins, claws, teeth, and in some instances gallbladders are being removed either for traditional medicine locally, or it's being shipped to the east where there's a demand. So by seeing where these animals are being killed and what body parts are being taken, we can kind of identify where the issue of trade is a threat to the species.
Okay, great. Good, thank you for shedding light on that. I'm going to pose a question now, I think, to more angels. It's from Caitlin. And she asks, with regard to helping communities access tangible benefits from wildlife, are local communities or local governments influenced at all by the powerful animal welfare lobby who might be against sustainable or consumptive use? And if so, how do you deal with such attempts to destabilize your work when, there's so many disparaging or disparate views about these issues? Sorry, my language is...
Yeah, I think in the past few weeks and months, there has been a lot of talk around that, and we have seen a lot of animal rights groups coming out. But I think at the end of the day, like the goal is the same. We all want the same. We all want to conserve, but the route that we take to get to that is different. But I think sustainable use is a very important part of conservation, especially in the local communities, because if people don't get the benefits, they have no reason to protect those animals, because at the moment they are facing the cost of living with wildlife, so they have to get the benefits. And sometimes the indirect benefits, they don't really make up for the cost that they are currently facing. So we need those direct benefits. Whether we are going to get them from trophy hunting or we are going to find another other alternatives, then we need to start thinking about those alternatives now, and we need to get everyone's input into that. And I think we won't go anywhere if people put each other into boxes of whether you are for trophy hunting or you are against. I think we have to start working together and support each other, and so that we can all, at the end of the day, be able to protect these animals. And I think I'm not sure about the current situation, but in Zimbabwe, the government is supporting the local communities through the campfire program, and there are some areas where it's paying the communities, they are getting the benefits, but also there are some areas where it's not working very well. So we need to look at these models again and try to find ways to adapt them or to make them work in the current situation that we are in right now.
And I'm sure, I mean, the COVID the crisis has not helped in terms of bringing benefits from, in those kinds of systems. Amy, I mean, you're no stranger to being in the middle of these discussions about putting people in boxes and the storm around the trophy hunting debate. Do you want to give some of your perspectives on what Marangel's just spoken about?
Well, firstly, I totally agree with Marangel that I think we should be looking for common ground, not what divides us, because there are so few people that care passionately about wildlife conservation. And somehow, especially on social media, people end up at each other's throats on this. And you think, actually, honestly, we have to look at the fact we all want wildlife there in the long term. And how can we devise, long-term sustainable strategies to make that happen and ensure that local people benefit? So on the trophy hunting debate, I mean, it is something, and I see there's a couple of Q&As about it, that does this really benefit people? It seems so counterintuitive. But I think we have to remember the primacy of different threats to wildlife. And the main threat to overall biodiversity, as well as to large carnivores, is the loss and the degradation of habitat and the loss of wild prey. So what we need to do beyond anything else is maintain wild habitat, and not canned hunting, which someone referred to, because that tends to be in smaller enclosures, not really wild habitat that has the conservation benefit. But trophy hunting does maintain more land across Africa than national parks do. So we have to maintain, as Marangel said, that if it's not going to be trophy hunting because of pressure, particularly externally, then we need to work with local stakeholders to make sure that new alternatives that are viable and scalable are put in place to secure that habitat, and really critically ensure that the revenue comes in from the presence of species like lions and elephants, which are difficult and dangerous to have around, to incentivize not only the protection of habitat, but the maintenance of those species as well. And unfortunately, we just don't have those alternatives right now. So taking it away at this present time, I believe, would do a lot more harm than good. We have to look at how to collectively use all of our wisdom and passion to come up potentially with better alternatives. And unfortunately, phototourism will not work in many of these places.
Yeah, and I think that as we've just experienced over the last few months, I mean, phototourism is incredibly fickle to any kind of ripple or shock that happens in the system. I mean, obviously, we've just gone through one of the most significant shocks of our lifetime, but it's been shown time and time again that it is a fickle business in many ways.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think we did a paper a few years ago, just looking at the fact that all the existing revenue streams we have right now, tourism, trophy hunting, state funding and donor funding combined, don't come close to what is needed for effective management of just Africa's protected areas. So we don't want to take away any existing revenue streams before we have better ones. I think there can be different, better alternatives. I think there can be global biodiversity credits, carbon credits, payments for nature, all these kinds of things, debt for nature swaps. There are things out there. And I think what COVID has also highlighted is that when there is political and social will to address a major challenge, we can rise to it. We can take extraordinary steps. But as you said earlier, we need to elevate the crisis facing nature to become central in that. And then we can build on that.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could show everybody in the, here a very good slide I saw earlier today about, this little island and this wave is coming and it's COVID, and behind it, it's climate change. And then behind that, it's biodiversity loss. And it's just, we've shown that we can, as you say, Amy, respond quickly when we want to, but we've got to be ready for these other waves that are coming. I'm going to ask a question to you, More Angels, back to you, sorry. So it's a question from Dr. Cheryl Ogilvie. So she's an academic at TUT and she's working in a rural community town in KZN, and it's a 21-year-old project. So she would love to get your contact details to hear more about what you're doing with communities and learn from you some of your success stories. She says, as we all know, I think it's not easy to engage with communities, and she wanted to know a bit more about how you empowered them. So I think what I'm going to do is ask, we'll get those details from Cheryl, and we'll put the two of you in touch if that's all right.
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah.
And also for you, sorry, More Angels, I'm just scanning through. There's lots of questions coming through. From Christina Hiller, she says, if we ask local community members you work with what lions meant to them from a cultural perspective, what will they tell us?
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting what people think local communities want or like, and what they actually want and like. So if you go to the local communities and talk to them about wildlife, about lions, you would be surprised to hear them say they love lions, they want lions to be there. And for us Zimbabweans, lions, they have a cultural symbolic, and they are a totem for some people. So they are important to them, and also these local communities see them as something that brings revenue to their communities through tourism. So they see lions as important, but they also say, they always put a but at the end of that statement, that they love lions, they want lions in their communities, but they don't want the conflict that the lions bring, because lions predate on their livestock, they sometimes kill or injure people. So that's the part that they don't like, but the part of having lions and benefiting from the presence of lions, they want it. So I think it's about dealing with the part that they do not want, so that at the end of the day they are happy, and we also protect our wildlife.
Absolutely. Sam, over to you. I mean, at the beginning of your career, you spent time around the western boundary of Kruger, speaking to farmers about cheetahs and wild dogs, trying to assess their attitudes, different kind of community. It's very different from what you're doing at the moment. And do you think, I mean, I'm going to try and get this talk back to the fact that we're celebrating Women's Day. Do you, are there any sort of pros and cons of being a woman researcher, doing the kind of work you're doing now compared to the work that you were doing when you were out there collecting the data and talking to farmers?
So where I did the surveys was actually in the Eastern Cape for my master's.
Oh yes, that was very nice. Yeah.
Same, but it was still surveys and interviewing people. I was quite fortunate enough to interview farmers around certain boundaries of the reserve, and then in kind of doing more rural communities where we had engaging workshops where everyone would kind of come together and we'd speak about wild dogs, and the fact that we were potentially keen to reintroduce them into the Great Fish River Nature Reserve. I've got to be honest and say that I didn't really find that there was any kind of difficulty in being a woman. I had a really great team with me who worked together, and I didn't really notice anything like that. But I do, as we all know, carnivore conservation is largely male dominated, and it can sometimes feel like you've got to constantly prove that you belong and that you've earned your place. But I think in the same breath, it's created a network of really strong women who work together, not in a competitive way, but together to motivate each other. And I think that's really inspirational and something that I'm really happy to be a part of.
Well, I was thinking earlier today about this talk tonight and thinking you know, at the Endangered Wildlife Trust, we are fortunate because we're headed up by women, and the senior management team is largely women, and certainly, you know, the whole culture of the organisation is one of equality. So I think that that's a great thing to be part of.
Absolutely.
Over to you, Amy. I'm going to ask you, Karine asked the question, what is your position about trophy or canned hunting, especially concerning carnivores in South Africa? And she says, just thinking about WWF and their position to justify trophy hunting by conservation value. And she realizes it's a difficult question, but it's, you know, it's one that we need to think about.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, as I said before, the key benefit, the conservation benefit from trophy hunting is exactly the same as with ecotourism or phototourism, because often it's not very eco. It involves a lot of carbon emissions and water use and things, but that's the protection of habitat. And so that should be the central components. And I think canned hunting does not offer that, at least for species like carnivores. You know, you don't have that protection of large areas of range in contiguous large ecosystems, and that's what we need for large carnivore conservation. So, for instance, we're in this process at the moment with the UK government looking for consultation on how we should, whether and how we should change the import of trophy hunting trophies to the UK. And my recommendation there was that we should actually use that opportunity to change the import regulations to ensure that you only allow in hunting trophies from places that have a clear conservation benefit, putting habitat conservation at the top of that. So, for instance, for lions, you wouldn't want them to come in potentially in an area of, if they were hunted in an area of less than, say, 500 square kilometres, if it was fully fenced, because you need to have them as part of that broader landscape. So I think canned hunting does not offer that. It also has huge welfare implications. It's linked with things like walking with lions and cub petting and lots of other things that I think are very, very damaging. So I think that should be addressed. And I know it's a major issue in South Africa. It's one that we don't really deal with, thankfully, in Tanzania.
Yeah, I mean, we've got almost 3 times the number of lions in captivity in South Africa than we have. Well, Sam, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. You know more about lions and the data on lions, but there's a huge number of captive lions here. And, you know, I think for those that, you know, listening that don't know, I mean, there's been a sort of subsequent offshoot from the canned hunting industry, which is about the lion bone industry, you know, and that's now an international trade. Where lion bones get sent out of the country and are, you know, part of an export process. So yeah, it's very contentious, and I would tend to agree with you, Amy, that I think if we're talking about conservation, then canned hunting is not conservation. You know, it's different. So I'm going to ask you, Morangel, and I think people bring this up a lot. There's a question here from, sorry, it's just been answered, I see, about the experience of Namibia in community conservation. And, you know, I think Namibia is so often held up as a real shining example of where community conservation has really worked. Do you think that those, you know, that experience has got something to offer the rest of Africa?
Yeah, I definitely think there are some lessons that we can learn from Namibia. We can learn on how they have been successful. And I think most of it is to do with the governance and the institutional frameworks. They have to be the right frameworks in to have the right frameworks in place. And I think the most important thing is having the community, the community should have the power to make the decisions about the management of wildlife and about how they want to use their resources. So I think there is some lessons we can learn from there, and we can, in Zimbabwe, like with the campfire model, it's also part of the CBNRM, and yeah, we are also trying to learn from Namibia and develop other community conservancies around Zimbabwe.
All right, thank you for that. I've got an interesting question here for you, Amy, from Eleanor. She says, as tourism is obviously dried up at the moment, is it not possible to give people around the world the wildlife experience on Zoom, for example, and charge them for it in order to revive the funding stream? Have you had any experience with any of those kind of efforts?
Not personally. I think all of these things are useful. We need a diversified, we need a bigger pool of people putting that money in. So if it was, rather than, 10 people paying $5,000 to go, you had everyone paying $1 to go and look at an African safari tour or something, then maybe that could replace it. Have reduced carbon, we'd have all the things, you could experience it without actually having the extractive element of that. So I think all of these things could really be valuable. We have to think outside the box. So yeah, I think these are great suggestions. We have to expand it and get people, but people will have to pay. And unfortunately, there's quite a lot of free models for that already. So we do need to make sure one way or another that people pay for the protection of wildlife, and that those benefits go to the people living alongside that wildlife.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't miss this opportunity to do a little plug for some current wildlife filming that's going on with the EWT and Painted Dog TV. There is a YouTube channel, and I don't have it with me, but you can Google it. And I just encourage everybody to go look. It's a pack of wild dogs that's recently been rescued in the Waterberg, and they're now in a boma, and there's a camera on, and there's puppies, and they are amazingly cute. And I've been going onto that channel fairly regularly just to see them. But, there is definitely a sense that, people can have access to experiences that actually many people can't ever afford. Most people can't afford to take a trip across the ocean to go and see big herds of game. And so maybe, one of the things that this kind of audio visual experience can give is more access to wildlife in a way. It's a bit of an equalizer. And I note here that Alistair says that Wild Earth and Eco Training are also doing great virtual tours. So I think certainly this last few months of the world being shut down like it has seen a huge amount of diversification in the way we do things. And hopefully that keeps going. I think we don't want this to stop. So I've got a question. I'm going to go back to you, Amy. Question about the mandatory quarantine measures that have had some positive effects on wildlife. This is these are not really carnivore related questions, but do you have any thoughts on that? I suppose there's this whole link between the veterinary controls and what does that mean for wildlife conservation?
So I wasn't entirely sure. So this is the quarantine period of people coming in and out of countries of tourists, or what did it? I wasn't 100% sure what that question related to. Okay.
Now that I read it again, I'm also not 100% sure. I was thinking more of along veterinary, veterinary restrictions around wildlife populations, but that was the kind of frame of mind I was in.
I think
this is really about COVID, and it's saying, with all the shutdowns and all, we've seen, the world has produced lots of stories of wildlife kind of resurging as a result of this. Have you had any experience with that?
Well, not personally. We do touch on it in this paper that now clearly I'm plugging. I'll have to send a link to it. But the paper we talk about, in the short term, there have been some positive benefits. We saw the reports, I think it was seals in Venice or something. I'm going to get that horribly wrong. But there have been, as you say, these ideas of resurgent wildlife populations and this temporary decline in carbon emissions as people are flying less around the world. And sort of pause, and people also exploring their own natural spaces and green spaces close to home. All these things have positive benefits at a micro level. Unfortunately, as we mentioned in the paper, they're likely outweighed by orders of magnitude at the global scale by these much bigger changes in funding streams and incentives for national governments maybe to invest in habitat protection when they're focused on rapid economic growth as well, and philanthropy tends to dry up. So I think there can be short-term positive benefit, which is great. And we should use whatever positive stories we can. But I think, unfortunately, it is going to be negative overall.
Yeah, and maybe on a slightly more sort of quirky story, I remember hearing something about some study that bird song was louder in the UK during this lockdown. But then when they went to go and look at it, they realized there just weren't any other competing noises that would normally be out there, like traffic and other things. So people had picked up this beautiful bird song, but actually it's because they don't normally hear it because it's drowned out by everything else. So yeah, we've got to be careful how we interpret some of these things. Sam, George asked a question about whether you can share with us some lion numbers. You've been collecting data now for the African lion database for a while. Is there anything startling that's come out of it? Are you able to share any figures?
Yeah, so the last kind of estimate we put together was in 2018 for the guidelines for the conservation of lions in Africa. And the estimate was looking like it was about 25,000 roughly lions in Africa, which is down from, I think it was 33,000 lions 10 years beforehand. So that's what it's looking like at the moment. And very interestingly, only 6 countries in Africa have more than 1,000 lions. And South Africa is actually third on that list. We have quite a good population of lions that's actually increasing, which is very different to kind of the trends we're seeing in other countries where population is steadily declining. But in South Africa, we're actually increasing, and that's also largely because we've got this strong, successful network of smaller reserves that contribute to the national population of wild lions.
Yeah. So just to be clear for everyone, you know, we're not muddying the waters by including any of the captive lions in any of those counts. I mean, you're talking about lions that are able to act like lions.
Yeah, free roaming where they can hunt for themselves, and breed and have their normal ecological behaviors, and it's not interviewed.
Yeah, so I mean, I think those trends that you're finding are very similar. They're mirrored with other species like wild dog, like cheetah. You know, there's, yeah, certainly the private ownership model of conservation areas has had, those are some of the benefits that have come from that model. There might be other downfalls as well, but certainly our ability to reintroduce carnivores across some of these reserves has meant that we've been able to expand the footprint really significantly. And I, again, have to just point out that the EWT has been pretty much at the forefront of that in South Africa. I'm quite excited about some of the work that our colleagues are doing to reintroduce wild dogs into places where they've gone extinct elsewhere. So recently into Gorongosa with the team from Gorongosa, wild dogs have been put into there, and they're doing very well. They've bred several packs bred this year and doing really well. So it is a little bit of a controversial process, this reintroduction, but certainly in places where threats have been dealt with, I think it's something that can be quite successful. So we've only got a few more minutes left here to ask questions, and I think I'm going to ask each of you to just reflect, because again, going back to this whole idea of it being Women's Month and you being women carnivore conservationists, if you could all give us any advice that you might have for young aspiring women conservationists as we kick off Women's Month in South Africa. And I'm going to start with you, More Angels.
Yeah, I think basing on my own experience, I would say it's an adventure. It has been an adventure. So I think if you choose carnivore conservation, you won't regret it. You will love it. And I think the advice that I can give is that it will be important for you to look for an organization that would support you and would be there for you as you grow in your career. And I think it's also important to have mentors around you and people that can guide you. And I think for me, I didn't really have that at the beginning of my career. So I was just like all over the place. So it's important to have people that can mentor you and can guide you throughout your career.
So, I mean, just talking about that, I remember when we were chatting a bit earlier today, you mentioned a paper that you're working on at the moment about race and equality in conservation. And do you want, before I'm going to let you sign off, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. I think the Black Lives Matter movement, it highlighted the need for everyone to really take a closer look at their actions and their contribution towards racism. And so as conservationists, we came together with a group of others from across the world to look at racism in conservation. And we took a closer look at that and tried to see how we as conservationists propagate racism in conservation. And I think it's important for us to look at how the history of racism and look at the colonialism and look at fortress conservation and how that has evolved to what we have today, where the lives of rural Black people are sometimes viewed as less important than the lives of animals. So I think it's a great opportunity for us conservationists and even the public to reflect on steps that they can take to ensure that there is justice and in conservation, and to reflect on how we can be more effective and just in our actions in conservation.
I think I'm so excited to hear that you're doing this work. I'm really looking forward to reading the paper when it gets published. I think we, up until now, probably haven't been at a time when you're able to ask those kinds of questions in that sort of forthright way that you're asking them, and to really dig down and do it in an objective way and with many collaborators. So I think that's really exciting, and thank you for asking the difficult questions. I see that there are a couple of other technical questions. I'm watching the time. I see that we've only got 8 minutes left. But I have to ask this question from Brendan Whittington Jones, and I'm gonna ask this to you, Sam. So he asks, is it correct that the current push for lion bone parts of trade is a spillover from reduced availability of tiger bones in the market? And if so, does this threaten to become an additional severe pressure on other carnivores in Southern or East Africa? So before you answer, Amy, I might ask you for some follow-up thoughts on this after Sam has answered.
So I think the answer is yes, and in short, and I think it is definitely spilling over to other carnivores. In February, I was very fortunate to attend the Convention on Migratory Species in India. It was the 13th Conference of the Parties, and there were some researchers from Argentina and South America who were presenting some information on jaguars, and they were noticing that there were these, like a strong increase in the number of jaguars that were not only poached, but had parts removed. And there were instances where those jaguars were specifically poached for their parts. So it wasn't an opportunistic, a jaguar's been killed, I'm going to take the parts. They were actually intentionally killed for those parts. So I think, unfortunately, there is that spill over to other carnivores. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. No, thanks very much, Sam. I don't know, Amy, have you got any additional thoughts on that?
Well, we've just been looking at this interestingly from both Ruaha and Wangi, so two very long-term projects on lions coming out of Wildcrew, and we're looking at sort of about a decade of data from our lion work where we've looked at which body parts have been removed over time since the beginning of the project, and similarly with Andy's work in Wangi. And interestingly there, we haven't found a significant uptick in the body parts being taken specifically for trade. We see a lot of body parts taken for local use, for proof of kill, for prestige, things like that. And you occasionally see claws and teeth go for sort of the tourist trade. But we haven't as yet, we've seen the occasional thing that might be indicative of either full bodies going for the lion bone trade or larger parts going. But at the moment, thank goodness, in those big populations that are more remote, we are not seeing this as a threat. It has, though, been highlighted, I think, in Mozambique and in other places. So it is something that we're definitely keep a careful eye on, because it could be a devastating threat to wild lion populations and then to leopards and to all the other wildcats that goes down the chains.
Yeah, I mean, that shows the importance of long-term monitoring and having those kind of data sets that you can really mine for that kind of information. I think it's easy for us to, you hear about one or two incidences and then suddenly this is a massive thing that's happening. And it's good to hear that those populations seem to be safe for now. So then I'm going to ask, as I asked More Angels, Sam, have you got any advice that you'd like to give to young aspiring women conservationists?
So my advice would be to learning and to say yes to opportunities where you can grow and learn something new or even perfect an existing skill you have. Advice that I still live by. I'm sure Harriet can probably agree that if anyone in the office asks me if I want to be a part of a project or help out on something, my automatic response is to say yes, regardless of my workload. And that's just because there is still so many things that you can still learn. It's limitless. So my advice would be to always say yes, although maybe in moderation. We all have. We all have to learn that balance.
Against the advice of your colleagues. I mean, Sam's absolutely right. What none of you know is that she actually is the coordinator of our ethics committee at EWT, which basically reviews all of the projects that we run at the organisation. She's my right-hand woman on that, and I'm so grateful that you said yes when you did. So, but we've all learned a lot from that process as well. So I think that's really good advice. Just to be a yes person, at least until you're old enough that you can say no, go away. But and then I'm going to ask you, Amy, the same question. What advice do you have for aspiring young conservationists?
Yeah, so I think More Angels and Sam have covered some key points, but I think just don't give up is my first one, because, right from the beginning when I said, even at university doing a zoology degree, I want to study big cats in Africa, that's what I want. They would say, yeah, but what's your plan B? And I'm like, hang on, why did we skip so quickly over plan A? And they said, because no one gets jobs in this, there aren't any jobs. And I was like, there must be some jobs. And so sure enough, and again, as Sam says, doing whatever it takes. So I joined Wild Crew, which was wonderful, and was insistent I wanted to work on big cats. And then they immediately sent me out to work on water shrews, which are like 15,000 times smaller than a lion. And then I had to work on water shrews, and then I worked on water voles, and David tried to get me to do a PhD on water voles. And it was just like, I think, keep your focus on what you want. And remember, that doesn't have to be traditional anymore. You don't need the zoology degree, the conservation biology degree. Conservation is such a massive field that people with IT skills, website design, music, poetry, whatever. I think we need all of that because it encompasses all of society. And so bring whatever passion you have and keep going at it, and you will make it.
Yeah, that's brilliant advice. I think just to add to what the three of you have said, which I think are all really valuable bits of information, is also just to not get too depressed, because I think that there are times when things really don't go right, and you're at the coalface, especially when you're out in the field, of some, of stuff that it can get you so dejected when you've witnessed firsthand, conflict between people and carnivores. So it's very easy to get down if you let it get to you, but you've got to scrape yourself up, and you've got to just put some happy smiles back on and get back out there, because there's going to be humps along the way, and there's going to be obstacles and things that get you down, and you need to have the strength of character to kind of climb over them and keep on going. So I think I'm going to now, I think we're almost exactly on time. I'm going to call an end to this discussion. I really have enjoyed it. It's been so nice to be able to talk to you about your experiences and to celebrate you as carnivore conservationists and as women. I think everybody who's listened tonight has really learned a lot. Sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions, but we'll definitely keep track of those and pick those out and address them to the right people after the talk. I'd also just like to thank very much the EWT communications and IT team, and for the fundraising team for getting everything flowing so smoothly in this talk. They've been doing these wild chat talks for months now, and it's always gone so well. So thank you so much to Tammy and Eve. And I'd also like to thank the audience. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the questions. Let's keep this conversation going. Hopefully our panelists have inspired some young women conservationists to get out there and make a difference. So thank you all.